Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Moon Society's
I
2023.
can't hear you, Ben.
You
Am
can't?
I at fault?
Uh, let's adjust the mic. How about that? Is that better?
Can hear you quite well, by the way.
Okay.
I can hear you fine.
Okay. So might
I'm
just
not
be
hearing
you,
anything.
Stanley. Is it better now?
Can other people hear Ben?
Yeah, other people
Can
can.
anybody hear me?
We can hear you.
I
but
can hear
you're-
you.
I'll log out and come back in.
Okay. We'll just wait a second for him to log back in.
What did most of the Swedish the contingent talk about?
Oh, we talked about some of the stuff that happened at the conference, some of the presentations, and we didn't really talk too much about the what a lunar settlement would look like, because the four of us have all talked about that amongst ourselves before. So it was just kind of an informal session. There was nothing really noteworthy. I'm not even sure it's going to be posted, just because there was only four of us and it wasn't really like an official event.
Mhm.
Stanley, can you hear me now? All right, well, let's get started. Oops, there's Stanley. Stanley, can you hear me now? You're muted, Stanley.
Yeah, everything's fine. It was a goof up on my part.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you.
Let me go ahead and start my little spiel and get this thing started. All right, as I was saying, welcome to the Moon Society's 2023 International Moon Day event. I'm Ben Smith, Moon Society Treasurer. For those of you who may not know, the Moon Society is a 23-year-old international nonprofit community composed of individuals, organizations, and companies committed to the permanent settlement of the moon and building a thriving cislunar economy. We are especially interested in commercial lunar development projects and are actively working to foster a social and political environment where such projects can thrive and be successful. The Society currently has lots of opportunities for people interested in lunar settlement, including some open leadership positions. And there is a link to the Society webpage. You can definitely learn all kinds of cool stuff, see what we're doing, see what's available. And we do most of our work in Slack. And there's a link to the page with instructions and the invitation if you want to get onto Slack and say hi. And if you're interested in volunteering, let us know. So this year's International Moon Day theme is beginning the new lunar journey for humanity. So what's International Moon Day? Well, in 2021, the UN General Assembly declared July 20th as International Moon Day. International Moon Day marks the anniversary of the first landing by humans on the moon as part of the Apollo 11 lunar mission. The Moon Village Association submitted the application to make this happen. MVA also created this annual event for the general public across the planet to celebrate this achievement and to raise awareness about the moon in general. And there's the link to it. Before we start the conversation about lunar settlement, I thought it'd be cool to watch a short video simulating what Neil Armstrong might have seen looking through the Eagle's window on final approach to the lunar surface. This video was created by the Arizona State University School of Earth and Space Exploration. And there's the link to that. All right, so I am going to go ahead and share screen and play this video. Hopefully it will work. Can everybody hear and see it?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, fine.
Yeah, I see it.
All right, so pretty cool, huh?
Mhm.
All right, so before we start, I want to ask everyone to keep their mics muted until you're ready to speak. And let's respect each other and not interrupt or speak over each other. And let's go ahead and start the discussion. What will a lunar settlement look like in 50 years if we start now? And just, what do you think it's going to look like if we actually started working on it now? Anybody got any thoughts, ideas? Yep, go ahead, James.
Okay, I'm basically a follower of O'Neill space settlements. And so to me, the moon is primarily a source of resources. And so think of it as basically a mining colony or mining company, company town. I could imagine also there would be something maybe like Sun City for retirees, wanting the lower gravity, and as well as vacation homes for people from the O'Neill settlements coming to the moon to decompress for a more frenetic lifestyle. In 50 years from now, I expect a very capable Earth to orbit transportation system made up of orbital rings. So I would expect something like 10 million people going into space each year. And so there would be a huge amount of growth, and just how much of that would come to the moon to settle and possibly even raise children, I think is somewhat up in the air. And that I think is probably the biggest question mark. Is a lot of people would probably avoid the moon because they want to have children and raise them in Earth normal gravity. But I can also imagine a lot of people finding the moon maybe less costly, and they aren't concerned that their children will be essentially forever tied to the moon.
Yeah, well, the gravity is the big question mark for long-term settlement, definitely. Anybody else got some thoughts on, if not what it will look like, what we should be doing to get there, or just in general? Because otherwise it's going to be a very short meeting if only a couple of us speak up.
Well, I hope it's the beginning of like one moon base after another that eventually grow into moon villages and then moon towns and moon cities. So I hope it's a real taking off place to an irreversible colonization of the moon.
Do you think it's going to be like what James said, though? It's going to be primarily mining to service orbital construction, or do lunar settlements have their own intrinsic value?
No, I mean, I hope it's more than what James said. I appreciate James's comments, but I mean, I'd like to see hundreds of millions of people colonizing the moon and it becoming a part of an Earth-Moon symbiotic relationship.
Sure, throw in a whole bunch of orbital settlements too, and you've got a real interconnected cislunar space.
Right, exactly. Interconnected cislunar, right.
Any other thoughts out there?
Sure, I'll add some comments. I'm Jim Wirtz from Microcosm and USC, and I just taught a course in low-cost lunar colonies at USC. And the key issue in my mind is twofold: that it should be low cost at some level, and that is done by a combination of government and industrial work. And largely it should be built for the purpose of making a profit, because we've been doing this for pure science purposes for 50 years, and the number of folks living on the moon today is pretty slim. And that means we need to do something pretty dramatically different. And I would argue that one of the things to make it dramatically different is to have it be in large part a profit-making activity. And we need therefore to look at what are the projects, and I've created a list of maybe 30 of them or so that can make high profits. And it's my belief that with a colony of say 1,000 or 1,500 or 2,000 people, you can probably have income of the order of 150 to $800 billion a year, something of that sort. And that's more than enough to make a lot of lunar millionaires and billionaires. And that in turn is what attracts people to come to the moon. To have fun, to do things, space tourism, obviously, helium-3 for power, obviously resources from the moon and resources going from the moon to other places. So that's, if you will, my vision of what I think a lunar colony can and should look like.
So Jim, what would be like the top one or two possible incomes that you see for a lunar settlement?
The single top income is probably energy from helium-3. There's been, of course, a lot of interest in helium-3 in terms of generating energy back on the Earth, because helium-3 can create a reaction that does not have radioactive byproducts. And of course, that makes it obviously much safer. I would say the single largest income probably comes from advertising. And that is to say, using the moon to advertise a wide variety of products that don't even necessarily have to be on the moon. You show a car literally driving around on the moon, and that attracts people that are interested in this kind of activity. And sports on the moon, for example, would also be very attractive, would be a high income activity. So I would say that advertising, entertainment, sports, in terms of products, probably helium-3 being the largest of the ones, but some other products as well, building things that will go further into space, because of course, getting them from the moon to deep space is obviously much easier because of the low gravity than bringing them up from the Earth.
Cool, definitely. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, tell you what my thoughts are. I'm a little different than everybody else. I think that trying to put government and corporations and industry as the primary drivers behind settlement is backwards. If you look at historically, people go into the wilderness, create their settlements, government and industry follow. Because if you have settlements, then you have a way to make money. If you have settlements, you have a way to tax. So I think that the reason we haven't had settlements yet, one of the reasons, is that we've been trying to do it backwards. I think that we should create the technology that will make it possible for groups to go out onto the frontier, create their settlements, and once there are enough settlements out there, then industry comes in and creates the transportation infrastructure. Government comes in and creates infrastructure. That's historically been the way that settlements have been created. So I think that settlements will be relatively small, not thousands of people initially. And if you give people the technology to do this, they'll also be very diverse, because small groups with certain ideas can get the technology, buy the transportation, and go start their settlement somewhere. So you get lots of smaller groups, smaller settlements that all have a very individual look. and feel to it.
Well,
That's how I think.
well, historically, the colonization of the New World by European powers, that was undertaken initially by governments, right?
They didn't create the settlements. I mean, look at it. For the first European settlement in the U.S. in the Americas was Roanoke, right?
Right.
Private venture. People got the money, got the backers, got the equipment, got the ships, went out there, created their settlement. Now it failed, but it happened. And then Jamestown and the rest, those weren't government mandates. Those were people looking for a new place where there wasn't a government to, oppress them.
But the Columbus expeditions, they were government funded from the beginning.
Yeah, but those weren't settlements. Those were exploration. Those were to establish new trade routes and find new places, which is different. Government's good for exploration, but not necessarily for settlements. Yep,
Well,
James. Oh, hold on.
That's
Go on.
probably true. I think we need more, we need to get the ball going. And I think government needs to do that and stay focused on Luna and not get diverted into, let's start exploring the sun and then Venus and this and that. But you're probably correct on settlement.
Well, governments don't have much incentive to create settlements. Settlements are high risk, especially if it's government funding and it's politically backed and everything. All it takes is one settlement to tank, kill a bunch of people. I mean, we've seen what happens in the US when a couple of astronauts die. Everything grinds to a halt. So the public is very risk adverse when it comes to that. So it wouldn't take much to just stop the whole thing.
Well, that's true, right?
So, James, you had a comment?
Yes, basically like with the Mayflower, with the Pilgrims, you begin like with exploration, with their government basically claims the land, and then the Pilgrims went to the owners of the land, basically the crown, and purchased the land that they were going to live on. And this was all basically a financial effort, though, where they had to either have their own money or borrow money.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had plans when they went to the New World to become commercially successful so that they could bring more of their people over who couldn't afford the first trip. And so basically making money is a key part of colonization. A standard practice with colonizing groups is that you take an extended family, they pool their money, they send the most capable individual over to the new land, and then that individual establishes a home, he makes money to repay the extended family, but they in turn uses that money to send the next capable person over, and he has already created a place for that person to be in the new homeland. And so the old people basically transfer their young people over into a new country. And that's the way colonization and today's colonization tends to work.
Right. But the settlements do have to make money at some point. But part of the problem I think that we have had is that we are putting the burden on the settlements that they have to make money immediately. It's very much a for-profit mentality, which is why we haven't been able to close the equation on that, because there just isn't anything that makes money immediately. Now, if you say, get backers, go establish your settlement, and then start repaying it, that's different than, oh, well, this thing has to go make a bunch of money right out of the gate.
Well, again, you're usually borrowing the money, so you have to convince somebody to loan it to you, which means they have to believe in why you're going to this place to make money. You may be going to the moon for religious reasons or whatever, but you need something there that the guy who's loaning you the money believes in. And the real problem, though, has been the cost of getting to the moon, the availability of that. And that is, we are still not quite there yet. We're hopeful that Starship will reach $100 per pound goal. That was supposed to be what was acquired with the space shuttle. But until the cost comes down, we really can't, the individual can't really afford to act and get to the moon.
Transportation, I think, is of course important, but I think more importantly is we have none of the technology that these settlers would need. Because if you want to cut costs significantly, stop shipping things from Earth, be able to build things locally. Not only does that cut your expenses dramatically, but it also reduces your vulnerability when something happens on Earth and you can't get your shipments. So I would say, yes, the transportation is part of the equation, but more importantly, we need the technology, the standard settler technology that anybody can buy and then go do. Because right now the technology is inadequate for the job. It's way more expensive than it needs to be because a lot of it is, high tech, bleeding edge, one off, not assembly made, not made to be made locally or maintained locally. Keith, you had a question or a comment?
Yes. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Keith.
Going to the dark side just a little bit here. The military bases in the colonization of the United States, there were competing sea powers, and Portugal, England, France. They set up military bases, and then some of the settlements built up around them because people wanted their families with them. They needed infrastructure. They needed goods. Also, criminal organizations. I mean, we're talking about the good guys going out into space, but there are criminal cartels tend to be profitable, no matter what we think of them morally. Also, there was a libertarian city set up near, I think, in Honduras a few years ago, and I don't think it succeeded very well, but ideologically, there are people that can afford and would pay for a new start somewhere to see how their ideal worked out.
I think that is absolutely true. I mean, you're right that in some cases settlements grew up around military bases, but the base wasn't created with the intention that a settlement would grow up around it. That was something that happened when people decided that they wanted to live there and they wanted the protection of the base, which hopefully won't be necessary on the moon, but hey, you never know.
Well, I'm thinking of the current situation that we're in. We have some major military powers, and China, I believe, is actively pursuing a base on the moon. And if China establishes a base on the moon, even if it's just a token base, the other powers are going to have to follow suit.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with the moon, I mean, you can only draw so much of an analogy between the Americas and the moon, right? Because they're both frontiers, but with the moon, there are significant international accords that limit what a national government can do. Like the US or China can't decide that they're going to grab, territory. I mean, I guess they could, but it would piss off everybody else on the planet and cause all kinds of trouble. So it's not quite the same land grab that it was, a few hundred years ago. But yeah, I mean, once they start setting up bases, especially around areas that are considered highly valuable, like, peaks of eternal light or permanently shadowed regions, then yeah, you can definitely see some conflict.
Let me add another area that would be of interest. And that is, I think you are likely to end up with embassies on the moon from a wide variety of countries, perhaps 100, 150, 200 countries around the world. And the reason for that, I would argue, is that if you have once started your settlement and you now have people living on the moon, looking out into the universe, that there are many countries that, if the price is low enough, would like to have someone on the moon. And there are two reasons for that. One is they don't want to see humankind expanding into the solar system and their country not being a part of it. That is to say, Portugal doesn't want to see expansion from the moon into other parts, or potential expansion in other parts, and nobody from there that speaks Portuguese. Now, what does the Portuguese ambassador to the moon do? Obviously, takes care of any visitors or vacationers from Portugal. Aren't going to be very many of those. That's going to be a small number. They're going to want a lot of attention because, of course, they tend to be rich folks. But what is he spending most of his time doing? And I would argue that he spends most of his time explaining to students back in Portugal what the moon is like, what the solar system is like, and doing that from the moon in Portuguese. What the Portuguese government doesn't want is somebody on the moon talking to students in Portugal in French, Spanish, or English. They clearly want it to be in Portuguese, so that's a part of the expansion. And of course, from the moon, it's about a 1 second delay to get back to the Earth with the signal delay time. There could be plenty of very good conversations between the Portuguese ambassador to the moon and students, elementary school students, high school students, college students back on Earth, explaining to them what it's like on the moon, and doing that in more or less every language that is spoken on Earth.
I could see that. I could see countries having value in that.
Right. The country sees the value in it, and it doesn't cost them a huge amount of money. You know, it's 1 or 2 or 3 people on the moon living in a house that they have rented or leased or whatever it is. That's a part of the lunar settlement. So you're talking about a cost that's, I don't know, the order of $10 to $30 million a year, in that range. And that's within reach of almost any country. But collectively, it adds up to quite a bit.
All right. James, you had a question or a comment?
Yes. Basically, the Outer Space Treaty says that we can't claim territory on the moon. However, if you get into the Outer Space Treaty and the background in it, what they were trying to do was prevent possible wars by where there was conflict with different countries claiming different land areas and having it overlap and then arguing over that, over their claims. So I see that as probably continuing, that countries will not lay claim to large land masses. However, the habitats are considered to be the property, essentially, of the nation whose flag that they fly. They have to be registered to a country. And those habitats will likely be considered to be territories of that country. The analogy is that of a ship in international waters. So we hear a lot about that we can't claim territory on the moon, but it's not exactly accurate. You can't claim land on the moon, but you can claim territory on the moon.
Right. I mean, that's what the Artemis Accords are for, right? To say that if you land there and you start extracting stuff, that belongs to you. That's not international.
Basically space and the celestial bodies in space are considered to be international territory. And this comes back that, well, who owns international territory? And the answer is we do. Every nation on the earth, every person on the earth owns international territory. And so that's the justification for why we can remove resources, because it's our resources.
Right.
As long as we don't extend beyond what would be considered to be our fair share of the resources, we don't have to ask permission from anyone else.
Ben, I think your comment that it's going to require private companies to set up settlements. Okay, that's good. I like that. I think that makes sense. But I think you're putting too much stock in international agreements that,
Well, I mean, the US did sign,
yeah,
did sign it.
things
Yeah.
get signed, and then when the necessity is there, then it becomes pieces of paper. And
See,
I can easily see if this thing ever gets going, I believe it will get going, conflicts between, like the United States and China over moon territory. I
Sure.
can definitely see that happening, and the international agreements are just paper.
Well, I think it's going to get even muddier because you can't necessarily, like James said, you can't necessarily claim territory, but if you have a base, you can claim an exclusion zone.
Right. Well, so then that's territory. That's territory.
Well, but if you base it on, it's an exclusion zone, so it won't kick regolith into your habitat, and everything within, X number of kilometers is excluded because of that. You're not claiming territory. You have a safety buffer for your habitat, because that's one of the things that a lot of international organizations are talking about, are these safety buffer zones.
I mean, that's territory.
But technically it's not. They're not saying it's territory. They're just saying we need this buffer for safety. Well, if everybody claims a huge buffer, now they're claiming effectively large swaths of land, and that's going to cause a problem.
I believe that will happen.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, these safety buffers are all the rage right now. Nobody really knows how big they need to be. But yeah, I'm sure everybody here has seen some of the stuff about it. It doesn't take much of a rocket to kick regolith all over the place at high velocity. So unless you're landing on prepared pads, you do need some kind of protection.
After the Artemis courses, this will probably be an area that will come to an international agreement as to just how far the safety buffers must be, the different criteria, whether it's protecting solar arrays or whether it's protecting an actual base and walking astronauts. I will bring up one other point, though, that's going to be probably controversial in terms of laying claim, is that we can use the natural resources of the moon to build habitats. And there is the question of, well, how big of a habitat can we build? So if we dome over Shackleton Crater and call it a habitat, then we're in effect confiscating Shackleton Crater, and not simply as a safety zone, but actually as territory.
Right.
So that I see. I think there's going to be different negotiations. What I hope to do is create the idea of an activity zone or safety zone or whatever, buffer zone or whatever people want to call it, and set a limit on how much area can be claimed by a country, and then also set how much area can be claimed through the creation of habitats,
So
and
Ben,
have them two interlinked.
Sorry, I thought you were done. So Ben, when do you think we'll develop the technology to create settlements? You're saying it doesn't exist now. You think it will exist in 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 5 years?
No, I think it's going to. The problem is that there's a lot we need to figure out, right? From the big stuff like, ISRU, and I'm not talking like the ISRU that they're working on now, where it's pretty high-tech pieces of equipment, small scale, being dropped on the moon and testing it out. I'm talking about ISRU that settlers can build themselves using their local resources so they can expand to their capability, something like that, down to the really granular stuff like, how are they going to make soap? Because everybody wants to be clean, and you're not going to pay the money to have soap shipped in.
So when do you
I know how. That's basic prepper knowledge.
If this doesn't happen, 100 years from now, would you be that we've developed that technology? Would you be surprised if it doesn't happen 100 years from now?
Sure.
You would be, so you'd expect that it would happen within 100 years.
Well, here's the thing. If we keep going along the current trajectory, I personally don't have much expectation that we'll have settlements. I think we'll have bases, government bases, maybe even some large corporate bases, maybe if there's a way for them to pull money out of it, which we haven't been able to prove yet.
But like, so a century from now, or are you anticipating there's going to be 5 centuries?
I think it depends on what happens. If we continue to rely on governments for settlement, I don't see settlements happening anytime soon. I think if we start working on the technology needed to settle, that's going to take years, decades to figure out, because it's not as easy as, like James said, okay, go to soap. You're right. Simple prepper knowledge, how to make soap. But how do you make soap when you can't import anything from Earth and you're starting from scratch? Like, where are you going to get the glycerin? Or old school soap used campfire ashes. You're not going to have that.
Why not?
Well, I mean, it's carbon. So you have to bring in carbon to do that. Carbon's going to cost money because
You have to have
There's-
food.
So,
And
so
that means you have
Yeah.
to have carbon.
you
you're
do.
pretty, actually, Ben, you're pretty pessimistic.
I am pessimistic with, well, I mean, if you go by historically, we have been involved in space for 50 plus years. And at best, we've had 12 white men land on the moon for a very brief period of time. And we've had a campsite in orbit. And that's basically a campsite. There's really not much going on up there. And if we stop supplying it for any length of time, it becomes uninhabitable very quickly.
What are you referring to? What's the campsite in orbit?
International Space Station.
Oh, and that's in orbit around Earth yet, not even
Yeah,
around the
that's it.
moon.
No, that's it. I mean, for 50 years, that's all we've really accomplished. So if you continue along the trajectory that we've been on, I could see maybe some bases. I mean, even look at Artemis right now. When it first was announced, it was going to be a regular cadence, building up infrastructure, and we would have mostly continuous presence on the moon. That was how it was sold. And now they're talking about, well, we'll land Artemis 3, get our flags and footprints, and then it'll be 2 years before Artemis 4 lands. Maybe.
Okay,
If the politics are still okay.
what about China? How is that affect, how does that affect your calculations?
I know next to nothing about the Chinese space program ambitions. I know that they plan on doing a base. I know that they're talking with Russia about partnering. China gets stuff done in space. And so I can see them putting a base down. I haven't heard anything about them settling. I think that they want to put a base down. They want to put more science packages. But I've never heard anything about settlement plans.
Let me haggle with you just a little bit on that. I would agree with you. By the way, I do agree with what you say. It is going to be challenging. I don't believe that there is a large amount of technology that needs to be developed. I think the technology to create the settlements on the moon largely exists today. I don't think you really need to do very much. I'll haggle over some of the details at some other time if someone would like to do that. But the bottom line of it is that you are going to have to bring some things from Earth. There is no question about it.
Mhm.
I don't want to bring everything from Earth. I certainly don't want to bring things that are massive from Earth. One of the heaviest things I need to bring from Earth is nitrogen. Don't have any nitrogen on the moon. It's heavy, but nonetheless, I want to create an oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere. We certainly want to do that. We can do that, but it means that we will indeed have to import some things from Earth, just like we will import some things from the moon to the Earth, like helium-3, for example. So I believe the technology very largely exists today. Doesn't mean we know what all the answers are. But I don't think,
What do you think about that,
Well,
Ben?
Well, I guess you need to define the technology, right?
right,
We have the technology mostly to put a small temporary base on the moon. Sure enough, we could do that with enough money. When I say the technology for settlement, in my in my book, that means that it is, well, if you caught my presentation at LDC on Saturday, it's what I call frontier enabling technology. And basically, it's stuff that can be manufactured and maintained using local resources and tools made from local resources. So there's a difference. There's a difference between bringing what we currently have as space technology to the moon for a base, because you're planning on constantly resupplying that base. And you're rotating people in and out of that base. So nobody's there for the rest of their life. Whereas with a settlement, the intent is that people are going to live there long term. And it becomes a completely different animal then. You know, if you told people, we're going to drop the International Space Station down on the moon's surface, and that's your settlement for the rest of your life, people would flip. Nobody would want to live there. So when I say the technology for settlement doesn't exist, that's because it has completely different criteria than the technology for exploration, which is what we currently have.
So James, how do you respond to what Ben just said?
Okay.
I'm saying James Wirtz, because you're the one who was challenging Ben. I'm curious what you think.
I'm sorry, I don't think I understand your question. Would you ask the question again?
Well, Ben was saying we don't have the technology, and you were saying we do have the technology. So then Ben said, so how do you respond now to what Ben just said?
Well, obviously what we have to do is to say what sort of technology is needed. One of the issues I would argue is that you want to create your, let's call it a settlement now. I think that makes good sense to make that distinction, in a large enclosed area. The large enclosed area, by that I mean an initial one might be the size of a couple of football fields. A larger one would be certainly bigger than that. But in any case, you want to make that out of aluminum. The aluminum is on the lunar surface and it's easy to do. In many respects, the initial conversation when this all started had to do with the O'Neill colonies. Remember the Jerry O'Neill's colony, 1974, stuff like that. And take that large colony and put it on the surface of the moon, because it's dramatically much cheaper to put it on the surface of the moon. And one of the advantages of that is that now you can build things on the moon much easier. Trying to build things or use tools out on the surface of the moon in a vacuum wearing a spacesuit is harder than all hell, that's clear. On the other hand, if I build an enclosure, and I now have people work with stuff inside. I want transportation inside the settlement. What do? I use a bicycle. Where do I get the bicycle? I go to Bicycles R Us, up the street. I can use tools from Earth if I'm not trying to optimize all of those tools for the moon. I'm just using all of the tools and processes that I already have that already exist on the surface of the Earth. I obviously have to reduce the cost of transportation. That's obviously another discussion, but I think the comment that was made earlier by whoever made it, that the new SpaceX rocket is getting the prices down to where they're very reasonable for our purposes. And I can use the existing technology to create the things that I want to create. Many of them. Desks, tables are made out of aluminum. And
So Ben, what do you think about what James Wirtz is saying?
Oh, hold on. Chris, you have something to say?
Yeah, I think that the discussion here gets down to focusing on different stages of the development. Yes, we could go within years with the technology we have, but you would be dependent on resupply from Earth. As you get better at your in situ resource utilization, you can lower the percentage that you have to import as you become more independent. Ben, respectfully, you seem very focused on the end game of, the long term, not having to be dependent on Earth. The technology, has to be developed. We might get, 90%, but then it's going to take longer to get to 95 and even longer to get to 98%, so on. If you look at the history of, bases and settlements on Earth, almost always they depend on some degree of trade. They can be 99.9% taking care of their stuff, but they usually have some trade with the outside. So, exactly at what point do you say that's a small enough percent that we're there?
Well, yeah, I think there's a difference between trade and relying on Earth for critical equipment and functions that if you stopped getting shipments, your base or settlement dies. I think there's a difference between that. And I'm just coming at it from the angle of, if we make the technology right, then anyone can go do it, create their settlement, expand their settlement without needing much in the way from Earth. Yes, we need nitrogen. There's not much there. We need carbon. We need hydrogen. There's always going to be some imports to the moon because it just lacks certain resources. And yes, they might be in the permanently shadowed regions, but all of that ice, if it is ice, it's all one big question mark at this point. We don't know the form it's in. We don't know how much is available. We don't know how to operate in those environments to extract it. So I think the safest way is to say, yeah, you're going to need some import from Earth, but if you can minimize that, then your settlement starts to look better financially, and it starts to look better from a vulnerability standpoint. Because settlers, by definition, are there for the long term. So you don't want to rotate them in and out, and you don't want them to have to abandon their settlement just because Earth's experiencing some problems and can't launch their resupply. Any other thoughts or ideas?
Ben, this is Chuck Schlimm.
Hi, Chuck.
Just talking about that, I'm trying to think of other analogies. It seems to me that we're going to start with basically company towns. Corporations going to go in and look for that profit-making center, and that profit-making center might be the water, ice, oxygen, hydrogen, rocket fuel, maybe supplying SpaceX for their trips to Mars. Who knows? And after that, solar power to Earth. So there are large potentials, helium-3 in the long term, but there are large potential profit-making centers. And so I agree. I don't think the government would be able to do that. That's going to have to be on a commercial basis. So you'll end up starting with company towns, just as in early days. They won't be the best of towns. They won't be the first family settlements. They'll be company towns, and they'll grow as people want to have more people there. I'm good with that. When you talk about having imports, I look at something like Hawaii. Obviously, they are dependent on a lot of imports, but that doesn't make them at very high risk. Those imports are going to occur if there is the continuing profit center there, especially if those imports are things that are not life support kind of things. If you're growing your own food and you're making your own oxygen, those things have to be done on the moon by the people on the moon. But when you start talking about other things, even materials to add to your industrial base on the moon, those things will be coming up in bulk kind of shipments. And we're talking 50 years out. So I am making assumptions that a Starship SpaceX kind of system will be in existence and transportation back and forth. So I don't think it's as critical to think that those things will be cut off. Anything today, yes, one glitch here or there shuts us down for a long time. But once you start having the material flowing and the commercial industry going, I think that will continue. I think that'll be an ongoing thing.
Yeah, I wouldn't be so worried about a glitch, but like look at the pandemic and how it impacted launch rates. You know, if we experience something worse or a bigger war or a financial crisis or I don't know, there's a list of things that are looming on the horizon as potential problems. And if something happens and all of a sudden it's not only more difficult to get critical supplies to your settlements, but also maybe back on Earth, it just doesn't seem that important. People are dealing with stuff here and they're kind of like, the moon, forget about those people. I just think that for a settlement, they need to minimize their reliance on Earth to the extent that they can, just because it just makes it a safer place to be. Keith, you had a question or a comment?
Yes, sir. We seem to be moving from establishment to self-sustaining implementation. And it drives me crazy when I see someone throw a piece of paper on the ground around here. That mindset will not fly on the moon. You will have to recycle everything. I read an article the other day about how the ISS, and I like your analogy of it as being a campsite, when they have dirty clothes, they toss them out because it's too expensive to take them back to Earth. They just throw them away. The good side of that is on the moon, we will have plenty of energy and the resources to build power plants. Even if there's not a lot of silicone or germanium, there's plenty of aluminum and iron that you can build solar furnaces with. They don't have to be particularly efficient. You just have to have enough of them to power your recycling machines. And once you have a certain amount of nitrogen, and I would hope that would be part of the package that any immigrant would bring with them, you can use that more or less indefinitely for the sustaining of that settler. As far as needing it for other purposes, that would have to be imported, just as they have to import certain things into the Caymans and to Hawaii and other island states that cannot produce their own resources in a certain area. So I was going to throw that into the ring too.
Yeah, I think you're right, especially with like nitrogen. If you're not consuming it, if it's just part of your life support system and you build your habitats to minimize leakiness, then you shouldn't have to resupply very often. You'd probably only need to resupply when you expanded your settlement and you had more habitable space you had to fill. All right. Anybody else?
Kind of begs the question, and I was wondering, Ben, if you've ever seen such a calculation for an average person. If you give them a certain volume of space to live in, work in, etc., plus all the food and processed being grown for them to eat, the fertilizer, the part of their waste that's in the waste recycling system at any given moment. Per person, how much nitrogen do you have to have? How much carbon do you have to have?
I've never seen, I think part of the problem is that you can kind of calculate that stuff based on the current tech.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, that's not necessarily the tech that settlements are going to need. So until we start building the equipment that a settlement would use, it's hard to calculate that stuff. I mean, you can go like to NASA and you can find out per person how much nitrogen, oxygen, and stuff like that is needed. But like I said, that's for a person on the ISS.
Well, yeah,
It's
the
not
ISS doesn't have like the gardens to replenish their oxygen, nothing like you'd have in a
Right.
settlement. Has anyone done the calculation for a settlement that you've seen?
Not that I have seen. James, maybe you've seen something?
Yeah, there's several books on closed ecology systems. So In fact, NSS has a couple of good books right now on the subject of O'Neill type space settlements. So that gives good references to numbers. Again, you have the issue. Typically, these don't estimate how much leakage there is in terms of a nitrogen atmosphere. And so that's primarily where you would have losses. You're essentially basically you're eating recycled food right now. The food you're eating, you've gotten rid of it through your waste system, and you're having more. You're growing more food. Well, guess where it comes from? The water that you drank was originally drank by dinosaurs.
Mhm.
So this is all what a closed ecology system is, that we assume that's 100% closure without losses.
A lot of what your background information come here is from the O'Neill settlements that we were talking about earlier. After O'Neill did his work at Princeton, there were 10 or 11 conferences, until he died, that had, I don't know, roughly 100 papers, 80 to 100 papers each, highly reviewed and all that kind of stuff. So there's something the order of 1,000 professional papers on how to build an O'Neill colony that indeed addresses most of those issues. I don't yet have all, I've got a large fraction of those papers, but there's still more of them out there, and it would make a lot of sense to create a library of all of those O'Neill papers that address in a very scholarly fashion exactly the issues that you're talking about. Because those,
I think
you're
NSS
right.
does have that. I think you can access NSS and you'll find that I believe they have all the conference papers.
Well, what's the way you're saying? An O'Neill colony?
Yeah,
You've
free
seen those,
space.
Stanley, the big cylinders in space, miles long with solar panels coming off them. Those are O'Neill colonies.
How you spell? You're spelling that O'Neil?
O'(Neil). Is there a second L? Can't remember.
I
No,
think
What's
there
this?
is. I believe there are 2 L's, yes.
Is this from the person's name who developed it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
if you go to Space Studies Institute, that was I think that was his organization. They've
Yes.
got plenty of information there. You go to Space Studies Institute. I don't know what the email the URL is. You'll have to
Okay.
search
right,
for
okay, Thank you.
also
there's all kinds of
National Space
information.
Society, essentially, the National Space Institute and the L5 Society merged, and the L5 Society is a grassroots version of O'Neill's work, and the Space Studies Institute was actually founded by O'Neill more for to develop the professional technical aspect of the colonies.
And just want to throw this out there. James, you were talking about a place to put all of this information. Well, the Moon Society has Lunarpedia, which is designed to be the place to put all of this information. Even if it's just a page with links going to other places. But that is the thought, is that everything we need could be on Lunarpedia, easily found and accessed.
Excellent.
It's a good idea. One thing I would wonder about, though, is that the studies that were done when they had their conferences, those were published by AIAA. AIAA is a pain in the butt when it comes to their papers. They want to control those papers for their own monetary support. So I'm not sure how NSS is doing it, but in other words, those papers actually belong to AIAA.
Oh yeah. Most papers are difficult to access or get control of. But even if you just have a link or an abstract, it's something. As I think that if you even just have a page that goes to where you can find it, then somebody who's interested can at least purchase it if they want it. But right now, I mean, all this information is just scattered everywhere. It's in books and papers and and if we had one place where we could at least find where to look for things, that would help immensely.
I just grabbed a copy of O'Neill's High Frontier, just to show that O'Neill cylinder.
Yep.
Everybody can see that on the screen. Just so you have at least an image of what they were talking about.
Right.
Mhm.
Yep, thanks.
Yeah, that is the classic image, much appreciated. And that colony is of the order of 3 kilometers in diameter and 12 kilometers long. It's not a small critter.
No, we're not going to go out and build one of those first. That's definitely an end use type settlement. But there are other ones out there, smaller scale. All right, anybody got anything else that they want to talk about?
Well, Ben, thank you for holding this. This is very,
Oh,
very
no
good,
problem.
very nostalgic, and I guess that's 54 years if I got that right. Yeah, so thank you very, thank you very
yeah.
much for hosting this.
Oh, no problem. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Ben. That was very nice to hear.
Okay, thanks.
You did a good job. It was really well done.
Oh, appreciate
That's
that.
good.
Thank you.
Yeah, very nicely done. Yeah, thank
I would like to recommend a book to people. It's a fictional work of fiction, but it's an interesting concept. It's called Mother Moon, with the idea that the human race is wiped out on Earth, leaving an international group on the moon. And fortunately, they're near sustainable as to their capabilities. One key technology, though, or service that they provide is that they are a repository for seeds and animal
Mhm.
DNA. So after you can imagine after the Earth is pretty much wiped out, they still have much of the ability to help and recreate what's on the Earth and send supplies back to the Earth.
You're right. There's definitely people that are talking about using it as a repository for DNA, for information, maybe even for priceless artifacts. So definitely something.
Do you know the author's name?
Offhand, I can't remember. It is, you can find it on Amazon and under Mother Moon. And it's actually 2 books, Mother Moon, I think it's The Dark Side of Mother Moon. And it spans several centuries after humanity has been wiped out on the Earth. And so the challenge they had, at one point they tried to go back and recolonize the Earth, and they think it fails. And they decide, hey, we're not going to work with that anymore. We're just going to continue as we are here on the moon. And so several centuries later, it gets into a lot of political issues that they've split off into different factions. And so it's like nations on the moon fighting over things. And there's also activity on the Earth from the people who were sent to the Earth who basically crash land in the ocean. And so they lose their tech, but not the food animals and plants that they need to survive.
Interesting. Have to take a look for that. All right. Well, if nobody has anything else they want to talk about, we'll go ahead and wrap this up.
All right.
Thank
All right.
you
It's been
very much.
fun.
Good night. Yeah.
Appreciate
Yep.
it. Good night.
All right. Everybody have a good night.